There is a clay tablet in the British Museum, approximately 15 centimeters wide, broken into three major fragments, inscribed on both sides in Old Babylonian cuneiform, that contains a speech no modern textbook quotes in full. The tablet is part of a series known as the Atrahasis. It was recovered from the ruins of ancient Sippar in what is now central Iraq, and the primary copies date to approximately 1635 BCE, during the reign of a Babylonian king named Ammi-Saduqa. The text on those fragments was first published in a critical edition in 1969 by W.G. Lambert and A.R. Millard, both of the University of Birmingham, through Oxford University Press. Lambert spent the better part of 2 decades assembling the fragments, cross-referencing broken passages against later Assyrian copies recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. What he and Millard translated is not a prayer, it is not a hymn, it is not an incantation for the dead. It is a set of instructions, delivered by a specific deity, named Enki, to a specific generation of human beings. Not the generation that came before the Great Flood, the generation that came after. And what Enki said to them, what the tablet preserves in careful cuneiform wedges pressed into wet clay over 3,600 years ago, is one of the most specific and least discussed passages in the entire corpus of ancient Mesopotamian literature. The tablet is still there. It has been there since the late 19th century, and the speech it records has never been answered. The Atrahasis tablets are not a single document, they are a 3-tablet epic, originally spanning approximately 1,200 lines, composed in Akkadian, the lingua franca of Babylonia, and the dominant literary language of the ancient Near East, for over 1,000 years. The physical objects held in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection are Old Babylonian period copies of a tradition that scholars date considerably earlier, possibly to the late 3rd millennium BCE, the Ur-3 period, when Sumerian literary culture reached its peak before giving way to Akkadian dominance. The colophon on the primary tablet, the scribe's notation at the bottom, identifies the copyist as a junior scribe named Nur-Aya. He copied the text in the 11th year of Ammi-Saduqa's reign. That date is fixed. The tradition he was copying from is not. Lambert's work assembling the fragments was itself a remarkable feat of textual archaeology. The primary tablets from Sippar were not found intact. They arrived at the British Museum in the late 19th century as fragments. Pieces of broken clay, some no larger than a human palm, mixed in with thousands of other fragments from multiple sites, multiple periods, and multiple genres. Lambert spent years identifying which fragments belonged to the Atrahasis series, matching broken edges, aligning partial lines of text across separate pieces, and cross-referencing against other copies of the same tradition recovered from different archaeological sites. The Assyrian copies from the library of Ashurbanipal, dating to the 7th century BCE, roughly 1,000 years after the Old Babylonian originals, provided crucial help. Where the Sippar fragments were broken or unreadable, the Nineveh copies sometimes preserved the missing lines. Where the Nineveh copies diverged, the Sippar fragments provided the older, presumably more faithful reading. The result of this painstaking reconstruction was a text that is still incomplete. Gaps remain. Lines are missing. Entire passages in the middle of Tablet 2 are lost. But the closing columns of Tablet 3, the post-flood section, the section that contains Enki's speech to the survivors, are substantially intact. The speech survived. Whatever else was lost to breakage, to erosion, to the 3,600 years between the scribe Nur-Aya's wet clay and Lambert's study at Birmingham, the institutional directives that Enki delivered to the generation after the flood are legible. They have been legible since 1969. The first tablet of the Atrahasis describes the creation of humanity. The gods are tired. The lesser gods, the Igigi, have been performing the heavy labor of digging irrigation canals and maintaining the infrastructure of the divine estate. They revolt. They burn their tools. They surround the compound of Enlil, the chief administrative deity. And in response to the crisis, Enki proposes a solution. Create a new being, a Lulu, a mixed creature, formed from clay and from the flesh and blood of a slaughtered god named Wheeler. That being is humanity. It is created to bear the labor the Igigi refused. The second tablet describes the consequences. Humanity multiplies. The noise of human activity disturbs Enlil. He sends plague. He sends drought. He sends famine. Each time, Enki quietly intervenes, teaching Atrahasis, a single wise man, how to mitigate the punishment. Enlil escalates. The third tablet describes the flood, Enlil's final solution, the complete annihilation of the species that was supposed to serve the gods, but instead became a nuisance too numerous and too loud to tolerate. But Enki intervenes once more. He warns Atrahasis. He gives instructions for building a vessel, and Atrahasis survives. But there is a detail in the warning itself that illuminates Enki's institutional position within the divine hierarchy. Enki does not warn Atrahasis directly. He cannot. The assembly has sworn all the gods to secrecy. Enki is bound by the decree. So he speaks to a wall. Specifically, he speaks to the reed wall of Atrahasis's house. He addresses the wall in the second person, as though it were a person. He tells the wall what is coming. He tells the wall to build a boat. He tells the wall to load it with animals and supplies. Atrahasis, standing on the other side of the wall, hears everything. The fiction is transparent. Enki has technically complied with the letter of the assembly's ruling. He did not speak to a human, while violating its spirit completely. This is not the behavior of a compassionate god moved by pity. This is the behavior of an institutional operator who has found a loophole. The reed wall scene, which appears in both the Atrahasis and the later Gilgamesh version, is one of the most distinctive narrative moments in all of Mesopotamian literature, and it tells you everything about who Enki is. He is the god who finds the workaround. He is the god who exploits the gap between the rule and its enforcement. He is the god whose relationship to authority is not obedience and not rebellion, but something more precise, compliance with the form while subverting the function. This is the deity who, after the flood, delivers the institutional directives to the surviving generation. The engineer who found the loophole now presents the patch. But it is what comes after the flood, the final columns of Tablet 3, that this video is about. Because in those closing columns, Enki does not simply save one man and walk away. He does not pat Atrahasis on the back and return to his temple at Eridu. He speaks. He lays down terms. He establishes conditions for the continued existence of a species that, by every indication in the text, the divine assembly had voted to eradicate. The generation that survived the flood, the generation after the last one, did not emerge into a restored version of the old world. They emerged into a new one, a world with new rules. And those rules were not the product of natural evolution, or cultural development, or gradual social change. They were decreed by a specific god in a specific speech, preserved on a specific tablet. That tablet is in the British Museum. The speech is in Lambert and Millard's translation, and what it contains has not been seriously examined by mainstream scholarship for what it structurally appears to be. If you find that mainstream scholarship on these tablets has left specific passages unexamined, if you suspect that the most consequential lines in these texts are the ones that never make it into documentaries, this channel is built for exactly that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been carrying. The rest of us continue. The conventional scholarly reading of the Atrahasis is well established and, on its own terms, internally coherent. Lambert and Millard's 1969 Oxford edition remains the standard critical text. It has been supplemented, but not superseded. Stephanie Daly, the Oxford Assyriologist whose Myths from Mesopotamia is still assigned in graduate seminars across the English-speaking world, treats the Atrahasis as a Mesopotamian theodicy, a narrative that explains why human life is difficult, why it is short, why some women are barren, and why infant mortality exists. In this reading, the post-flood instructions are etiological. They exist to explain existing social realities by projecting them backward into divine decree. The barren woman exists because the gods decreed barrenness. The priestess, who does not bear children, exists because the gods created a class of women set apart from biological reproduction. The demon Pashittu, who in the text snatches infants from their mothers, exists because infant death needed a mythological cause. Every painful feature of human existence receives a divine origin, and the narrative is structured so that divine anger and divine mercy together produce the world the audience already inhabits. Samuel Noah Kramer, the Sumerologist who spent decades at the University of Pennsylvania Museum translating foundational Sumerian texts, and who is credited with identifying and publishing more Sumerian literary works than any other scholar of the 20th century, framed the broader flood tradition similarly. It was myth doing the work of philosophical explanation. The world is the way it is because the gods made it so, and the flood was the pivot point, the fulcrum between a primordial state and the present condition. Leo Oppenheim, the Austrian-born Assyriologist who directed the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary project at the Oriental Institute for decades, approached the same texts through a lens of institutional analysis, but arrived at the same conclusion. The Atrahasis was, for Oppenheim, a literary composition that used mythological narrative to encode social realities, not a historical record of events. The post-flood passage, in the mainstream consensus, is a just-so story, an elegant one, a structurally sophisticated one, but a just-so story nonetheless. This is the reading that appears in virtually every mainstream textbook, every museum placard, every BBC and Discovery Channel documentary that touches Mesopotamian flood literature. It is the reading that students encounter in their first Assyriology seminar, and for most students, it is the reading they carry through their entire careers. And it should be said clearly that the etiological reading is not a dismissal of the text. It is a serious interpretive framework with considerable explanatory power. Etiological myths are among the most common and most psychologically potent forms of narrative in any culture. The Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone explains the seasons. The Norse myth of the mead of poetry explains why some people can compose verse and others cannot. The biblical account of the Tower of Babel explains the diversity of languages. In each case, a narrative about the past is structured to account for a present reality. The power of the form lies in its ability to make suffering meaningful, to transform arbitrary misfortune into divine consequence, to convert the randomness of nature into the deliberation of gods. The Atrahasis post-flood passage fits this pattern neatly when read in isolation. Barrenness is painful. The narrative gives it divine origin, and in doing so, gives it dignity. Infant death is devastating. The narrative gives it a name, Pashittu, and in doing so, makes it comprehensible. The etiological framework does real intellectual and emotional work. It is not wrong to read the Atrahasis this way. The question is whether it is complete, because the etiological reading, for all its explanatory power, makes a specific assumption that it never examines. It assumes that the specificity of the post-flood directives is decorative, that the ancient scribe added institutional detail to give the mythological narrative a veneer of bureaucratic realism, the way a modern novelist might add technical jargon to make a fictional corporate memo feel authentic. This assumption is not argued, it is not defended. It is simply present, embedded in the interpretive framework like a load-bearing wall that no one tests because everyone has agreed it is there. And when you remove that assumption, when you ask not whether the institutional detail serves the mythology, but whether the mythology serves the institutional detail, the text reads differently. Not unrecognizably differently, but differently enough to warrant attention. What the conventional reading does not do, and this is the pivot that alternative researchers have been pointing at for 5 decades, is account for the specificity of what Enki actually says, because Enki's post-flood speech is not vague. It is not a general blessing or a general curse. It is not an omnibus declaration that life will now be harder. It is a sequence of concrete institutional directives, each one targeting a specific mechanism, each one interlocking with the others to form a coherent system. And the question that has driven researchers outside the mainstream to these tablets for decades is a simple one. Why would a mythological epilogue need to be this specific? Why would a scribe composing a theological narrative, a just-so story about why the world looks the way it does, take the trouble to specify 4 distinct functionally interlocking mechanisms of population control? The text does not say the gods decided to limit humanity and leave it at that. It says Enki, specifically Enki, over the objections of Enlil in a negotiation within the divine assembly, proposed a set of mechanisms. The Akkadian is precise. Lambert and Millard's translation renders the passage with categories that read less like mythology and more like policy. First, there will be, among women, those who bear and those who do not bear. This is not a description of natural variation. The verb form is jussive, a command, a decree. Second, there will be a specific class of priestess, the entu, set apart from ordinary women, institutionally prohibited from bearing children. Third, there will be a demon, Pashittu, assigned to take infants. Assigned, not unleashed as punishment, assigned as a function. Fourth, there will be a natural limit on the human lifespan. Not a curse, a parameter. These 4 directives are not scattered across the text as separate etiological notes. They appear in sequence, in a single speech, delivered by a single deity, to a single surviving population. And the distinction matters enormously, because the conventional reading treats each directive as an independent explanation for a separate feature of human existence, while the alternative reading, advanced most prominently by Zecharia Sitchin in his 1976 book The 12th Planet, and extended in his 1985 work The Wars of Gods and Men, treats them as components of a single integrated system, a post-flood protocol, a managed restart. The methodology Sitchin used to arrive at this reading is worth examining on its own terms. Not because it is beyond criticism, it is not, but because the criticism has consistently targeted his biography rather than his textual analysis. Sitchin was not trained as a conventional Assyriologist. He studied economics and journalism at the London School of Economics in the 1950s, and his knowledge of Sumerian and Akkadian was largely self-taught over decades of independent study. His critics have used this biographical fact as the primary instrument of dismissal. He was not credentialed. He had not passed through the gatekeeping institutions of Assyriology. He could not read the tablets in the original the way Lambert or Millard or Daly could. And these objections have weight. The field of cuneiform studies is technically demanding. Sign values are polyvalent. A single cuneiform sign can represent multiple syllables or whole words, and the correct reading depends on context, period, dialect, and genre. Mistakes are easy to make, and Sitchin made some, but his method, whatever one thinks of his conclusions, was textual. He worked from published transliterations, principally those collected in the series Cuneiform Texts from Babylonian Tablets in the British Museum. He cross-referenced sign values across multiple lexical lists, the ancient scribal dictionaries that Mesopotamian students used to learn their craft. He consulted multiple published translations, and in the case of the Atrahasis post-flood passage, he did something that mainstream scholars had not done, which was to read the institutional directives not as individual etiological units, but as a coherent administrative package. His argument was structural, not philological. If you read the post-flood passage as a standalone document, strip away the narrative frame of gods and floods and divine assemblies, and read only the directives themselves, what remains is a population management protocol, controlled fertility, institutionalized celibacy among a designated class, infant mortality as a regulatory mechanism, lifespan limitation as a design parameter. These are not random narrative details. They are, Sitchin argued, the components of a designed system, a system with a purpose, a system whose internal logic only becomes visible when you read the directives together rather than parsing them as isolated explanations for isolated phenomena. Sitchin also drew attention to a feature of the post-flood passage that is easy to miss if you read it as isolated mythology, but impossible to ignore if you read it as institutional policy. The speech is not a monologue delivered into empty space. It occurs within a scene of negotiation. Enlil is present. Enlil is angry. He did not sanction human survival. He demanded extinction, and when he discovers that Atrahasis has survived, his fury is directed at Enki, not at the humans. The confrontation between Enlil and Enki in the closing section of Tablet 3 is a power struggle between two institutional actors with competing priorities. Enlil wants the program terminated. Enki wants it continued under modified terms. The post-flood directives are Enki's offer, his proposal to the assembly that makes preservation viable by addressing the original complaints. The population will not grow unchecked because fertility is now stratified. The lifespan will not allow dangerous accumulation because it is now bounded. The system will include automatic correction mechanisms, Pashittu, infant mortality, that prevent the kind of exponential growth that triggered the crisis. Read as mythology, this scene is a colourful argument between two gods. Read as institutional process, it is a board meeting in which one executive justifies an unauthorized decision by presenting a remediation plan. And that distinction, colourful mythology versus institutional process, is precisely the question Sitchin posed. It is not a question about whether the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials. It is a question about what genre of document the Atrahasis actually is. The question Sitchin posed, and which has not been answered in any peer-reviewed Assyriological journal in the half-century since he published it, is this. If these details are purely mythological, why are they structured as interlocking policy rather than as isolated etiological vignettes? The conventional reading accounts for each detail individually. The barren woman explains barrenness. The Pashittu demon explains infant death. The entu priestess explains temple celibacy. The shortened lifespan explains mortality. But the conventional reading does not account for why these details appear together, in sequence, as a single speech delivered by a single deity to a specific surviving population, within a text that has already, in Tablet 1, demonstrated sophisticated awareness of institutional structure, bureaucratic process, labor disputes, and administrative problem-solving. The implications of reading the post-flood passage as institutional rather than mythological are considerable, and they extend well beyond the Atrahasis itself. If Enki's speech to the post-flood generation is a governance document rather than an etiological myth, then the flood narrative changes character entirely. It is no longer a story about divine anger and miraculous rescue. It is a story about institutional failure and managed reconstruction. Consider the pre-flood world as the Atrahasis describes it. It is not chaotic, it is ordered. Humanity was created, Tablet 1 is explicit about this, to perform the labor that the Igigi, the lesser gods, had refused to continue. The creation of humans was itself an institutional solution to a labor dispute among divine beings. The humans worked, they dug canals, they maintained temples, they produced food for the gods' tables, the regular offerings described in thousands of temple administrative documents from across Mesopotamia. And the conditions that led to the flood, noise, overpopulation, the disruption of Enlil's rest, read in this institutional framework not as divine caprice but as symptoms of a system that outgrew its design parameters. Too many workers, too much activity. The infrastructure could not absorb the output. The flood was not wrath, it was a system correction. And Enki's post-flood speech, directed at the survivors, the generation after the last one, was the specification for the new system. Not a restored system, a redesigned one. This reading is consistent with a broader pattern in Mesopotamian administrative literature that mainstream Assyriology itself has documented exhaustively. The Sumerians and Babylonians were, by every archaeological measure, among the most bureaucratically sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world. They invented writing not for poetry but for accounting. The earliest tablets from Uruk, dating to approximately 3200 BCE, are grain tallies, livestock inventories, labor assignments. The temple archives of Nippur, Girsu, and Lagash contain tens of thousands of administrative tablets. The Code of Hammurabi, carved on a black diorite stele, now standing in the Louvre, over 2 meters tall, inscribed with approximately 282 legal provisions, is itself a comprehensive institutional document. The idea that a Mesopotamian text would embed institutional policy within a narrative frame is not radical. It is not even unusual, it is exactly what Mesopotamian scribes did routinely. The temple hymns of Enheduanna, the Akkadian priestess of who is the earliest known named author in human history, function simultaneously as devotional poetry and as institutional charters for the temples they describe. The Atrahasis fits this pattern. It tells a story. The story contains policy. The question is not whether the policy is there, Lambert and Millard translated it clearly, but whether it is literary imitation of institutional language or actual institutional content delivered through narrative form. Sitchin argued the latter. Mainstream scholarship assumes the former. Neither side has published a dispositive argument that settles the question. And the institutional framing is not something the alternative reading imposes from the outside. It is present in the Atrahasis from the very first lines. Tablet I opens not with a creation hymn, but with a labor grievance. The Igigi, the younger gods, the working class of the divine hierarchy, have been digging canals for 40 years. 40. The text gives a number. They are exhausted, they are resentful, and their response is not prayer or supplication, it is organized collective action. They burn their tools, they march on Enlil's compound, they surround it at night. Enlil is frightened, he calls an assembly, the senior gods, the Anunnaki, convene. And the solution they arrive at is not mystical, it is administrative. Create a substitute labor force. Create beings who can bear the work the Igigi refuse. The entire creation of humanity, in the Atrahasis, is framed as a human resources solution to a divine labor dispute. The vocabulary of Tablet 1, the corvée, the workload, the complaint, the assembly, the proposal, the vote, is the vocabulary of institutional administration. It reads like minutes from a crisis meeting, not like a hymn to the mystery of creation. And the creation process itself is described with a specificity that mirrors institutional procedure. The god Weyala is selected for slaughter, not randomly, but because he has temu, a term Lambert and Millard translate as intelligence or rationality. His flesh and blood are mixed with clay by the birth goddess Nintu, also called Mami in some passages, and the mixture is divided into 14 portions. 7 male, 7 female. The creation is not a single miraculous act. It is a production run. 14 units, allocated by sex, manufactured from specified raw materials, assigned a specific purpose, to bear the workload the Igigi had abandoned. The institutional character of the text is not something that emerges only in the post-flood section. It is present from the first column of Tablet 1. The creation is an institutional act. The flood is an institutional failure. And the post-flood speech, in this light, is an institutional repair. Thorkild Jacobsen, the Danish-American Assyriologist who spent decades at Harvard and the Oriental Institute in Chicago, noted this institutional texture in his Treasures of Darkness, published in 1976. The same year, Sitchin published The 12th Planet. Jacobsen did not draw the same conclusions Sitchin drew, but he observed the same phenomenon. The Atrahasis is not written in the register of mythological wonder. It is written in the register of institutional problem-solving. And if the text begins as an institutional narrative, if the creation of humanity is itself an administrative act, then the question of whether the post-flood restructuring is also an administrative act becomes considerably less exotic. It becomes a question about whether the text maintains its own internal register from beginning to end. And the simplest answer, the answer that requires the fewest assumptions, is that it does. The flood itself, in this institutional reading, acquires a different character. The conventional reading treats the flood as a divine tantrum. Enlil was annoyed by noise, so he destroyed everything. Scholars have debated what the noise represents. Some read it literally. Others, like Moran in his 1987 article, interpret it as overpopulation itself, the sheer biological pressure of too many humans. But in the institutional framework, the noise is system overload. The infrastructure, the canals, the temples, the agricultural network, was designed for a certain capacity. Humanity exceeded that capacity. The flood was not punishment for sin. It was not anger at disobedience. It was the termination of a failed program. And Enki's intervention, his unauthorized warning to Atrahasis, was not compassion in the way modern readers understand that word. It was dissent within the administrative hierarchy. Enki disagreed with the decision. He circumvented the majority vote. He preserved the asset that the assembly had voted to liquidate. And then, after the flood, when Enlil discovered that humans had survived and his anger was at its peak, Enki negotiated. The post-flood directives are the terms of that negotiation. They are the compromise between a faction that wanted total termination and a faction that wanted preservation under new constraints. This is not a reading that requires extraterrestrial hypotheses. It is a reading that takes the text's own institutional vocabulary at face value. And it is worth noting that Enki's position in this negotiation is precarious. He acted unilaterally. He countermanded a majority decision of the Divine Assembly. In any institutional framework, ancient or modern, that is an act with consequences. The post-flood directives are not just policy for humanity. They are Enki's justification to his peers. They are his case that the unauthorized preservation of the species will not produce a repeat of the conditions that made the flood necessary. Every directive addresses a specific complaint from the pre-flood narrative. Unchecked population growth was the trigger. Fertility stratification and institutional celibacy address the growth rate. Excessive lifespan allowed humans to accumulate capability and become, in Enlil's view, ungovernable. Lifespan limitation addresses that accumulation. The system lacked automatic correction mechanisms. Enlil had to intervene personally each time, with plague, with drought, with famine. The Pashittu demon institutionalizes the correction, making it automatic rather than requiring divine action. The internal logic is tight. Each directive maps to a specific pre-flood failure mode, and that mapping, problem to solution, complaint to countermeasure, is not the structure of myth. It is the structure of a remediation plan. Consider what the text specifically prescribes, line by line, because the details are not casual and they are not decorative. The first directive concerns fertility. Enki establishes, and the verb form in Akkadian is decisive, active, imperative, that among women there will be those who bear children and those who do not. This is not a description of natural variation being observed and recorded. The text frames it as an imposed category. Lambert and Millard translate the relevant lines with language that distinguishes decree from observation. It is not Enki noticing that some women are infertile. It is Enki creating infertility as a class. The second directive concerns the establishment of a specific priestly class. The entu priestess is a well-documented institution in Mesopotamian society. Administrative records from the great Sumerian city excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 30s, document entu priestesses by name. Records from Sippar document their property holdings, their legal transactions, their institutional privileges. The Naditum, a related class of cloistered women, also prohibited from bearing children, left behind an entire archive of legal and commercial documents from the Old Babylonian period. These are real institutions. They existed. They are archaeologically verified. And the Atrahasis says they were created, not developed, not evolved, not adopted by cultural convention, but created, by divine decree, as part of the post-flood restructuring. The third directive is the most disturbing and the most specific. The demon Pashittu, sometimes associated with the more widely known Lamashtu figure in later Assyrian protective incantation literature, is assigned to take infants. The text does not describe this as a curse visited upon a sinful population. It does not describe it as the unfortunate byproduct of a chaotic post-flood world. It describes it as a mechanism, an assigned function within a designed system. The infant-taking entity is not an enemy to be fought. It is a parameter to be accepted. And the fourth directive, the limitation of the human lifespan, frames mortality not as a tragic consequence of the human condition, not as the inevitable entropy that all flesh must endure, but as a calibrated setting, a number that was chosen, a boundary that was imposed. These four directives together constitute what Sitchin called the post-flood protocol, and the structural coherence of the package, fertility control, institutional celibacy, regulated infant mortality, lifespan limitation, is what makes the purely mythological reading difficult to sustain without significant qualification. The archaeological record corroborates the institutional reality of at least two of these directives in ways that deserve specific attention. The entu priestesses are not hypothetical figures. They are documented in administrative archives spanning centuries. At During the Third Dynasty, approximately 2100 to 2000 BCE, the entu of the moon god, Nana, held enormous economic and political authority. She managed temple estates. She oversaw agricultural production. She conducted legal transactions in her own name. At Sippar, during the Old Babylonian period, the same era from which the Atrahasis copies survive, the Nadatum women occupied a cloister known as the Gagum. The Gagum is archaeologically attested. It was a walled compound within the city, housing women who were institutionally prohibited from bearing children, but who were permitted to adopt, to own property, and to conduct business. Their documents survive by the hundreds. Their economic activity is documented in contracts, receipts, inheritance disputes. These are not mythological beings. They are historical women, living within a historical institution, fulfilling a role that the Atrahasis attributes to divine post-flood decree. The conventional reading says the scribe projected an existing institution backward into mythological time to give it divine sanction. The alternative reading says the institution exists because the directive was implemented. Both readings are coherent. Neither has been definitively falsified. But only one of them accounts for the text's own framing, which is that the institution was created, not observed. The Pashittu directive is harder to verify archaeologically, but the incantation literature of later Mesopotamia is densely populated with protective rituals against infant-taking demons. Markham Geller, the Assyriologist at University College London who has published extensively on Babylonian medical and magical texts, has documented the elaborate apotropaic traditions, clay figurines, incantation bowls, amulet sequences, designed specifically to protect infants and birthing mothers from demonic attack. These traditions persisted for over 1,000 years. They were not marginal folk practices. They were mainstream, institutionally supported, temple-administered protective systems. If the Pashittu directive in the Atrahasis is mythological, it generated one of the most durable and well-funded institutional responses in Mesopotamian religious history. If it is institutional, then the protective rituals are not superstitious responses to imagined threats. They are countermeasures within a system that acknowledged infant mortality as a designed feature. The academic response to Sitchin's reading of the Atrahasis post-flood passage has followed a pattern that is by now familiar to anyone who studies how alternative scholarship is received within credentialed disciplines. The response was not engagement. It was categorization. Sitchin's work was classified, not refuted, classified, as pseudo-archaeology. It was placed in the same conceptual bin as ancient astronaut theory generally, alongside Erich von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods and the more sensationalized claims of the History Channel era. And once placed in that bin, it was addressed, when it was addressed at all, at the level of category rather than at the level of specific textual claims. The logic was circular. The claim is pseudo-archaeology. We know it is pseudo-archaeology because it comes from Sitchin. We know Sitchin produces pseudo-archaeology because his claims are classified as such. At no point in this cycle does a specific passage get examined on its specific merits. Michael Heiser, the biblical scholar and Semitic languages specialist who held a doctorate in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, is the most prominent exception to this pattern, and his work deserves careful attention. Heiser devoted years to critiquing Sitchin's linguistic methodology. He challenged specific sign readings, specific choices Sitchin made about how to render individual cuneiform signs and how to parse compound Sumerian terms. His website, which operated for years under the domain sitchiniswrong.com, catalogued dozens of instances where Sitchin selected minority sign values, unconventional grammatical parses, or idiosyncratic translations that supported his thesis when more standard readings pointed elsewhere. And some of those challenges have genuine merit. Sitchin's rendering of the Sumerian term ti, it, which Sitchin translated as that which is with life, interpreting it as a reference to genetic material, is debatable on philological grounds. The sign ti has multiple values, and Heiser argued convincingly that Sitchin chose the value that served his narrative rather than the value that context and convention supported. Similarly, Sitchin's reading of the term Adam as a collective noun for a created worker class, rather than as a personal name or a generic term for humanity, involves interpretive choices that mainstream Sumerology would not endorse. This is legitimate critique. It is specific. It engages with the text. It is the kind of counter-argument the field should produce. And if the entire body of Sitchin's work consisted of individual philological claims, isolated assertions about what this or that cuneiform sign means, then Heiser's critique would be comprehensive. But Sitchin's argument about the Atrahasis post-flood passage does not rest on any single sign reading. It rests on the structural relationship between multiple directives within a single textual unit. You could correct every sign reading Heiser identified. You could replace every minority value with the majority consensus, and the structural question would remain exactly where it was. The four directives would still appear in sequence. They would still address interlocking mechanisms. They would still constitute what looks, structurally, like an integrated population management protocol. Heiser's critique is necessary, but not sufficient. It addresses the bricks while leaving the architecture unexamined. But Heiser's work, thorough as it is on the level of individual sign values, does not address the structural argument about the post-flood passage. The question of whether the Atrahasis closing columns read as a coherent institutional package is not a question about whether Ti means rib, or life, or essence. It is a question about textual architecture, about the relationship between four directives that appear in sequence within a single speech. And on that question, the question of structure, the academic literature is largely silent. No peer-reviewed article in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies has published a sustained analysis of why the Atrahasis post-flood directives are structured as an interlocking set of population management mechanisms rather than as isolated etiological explanations. No article in the Revue d'Assyriologie et d'Archéologie orientale has addressed Sitchin's structural argument specifically. No monograph published by any university press has engaged with the institutional reading hypothesis at the level of the text itself. The sign readings have been challenged. The credentials have been questioned. The category has been assigned. But the structural question, why these four directives, in this sequence, in this speech, by this deity, to this specific population, remains exactly where Sitchin left it in 1976, unaddressed. The question has not been refuted. It has not been engaged. It has been placed outside the boundary of serious discussion by a process that is more accurately described as sociological than intellectual. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Dismissal requires only a label. And a label is what Sitchin received. The pattern extends beyond Sitchin. Consider the reception of Avi Loeb, the Harvard astrophysicist who proposed that the interstellar object detected in 2017, the object designated as the first confirmed visitor from beyond our solar system, exhibited anomalous acceleration consistent with a manufactured light sail rather than a natural cometary body. Loeb holds a named chair at Harvard. His credentials are not in question. His data was published in peer-reviewed astrophysics journals, and the response from much of the astronomical community was not engagement with his specific calculations. It was categorization. He was placed in the bin of scientists who had gone fringe. His institutional affiliation protected him from the career consequences that less established researchers would have faced, but the mechanism of dismissal was identical to the one applied to Sitchin. Categorize the claim, assign a label, decline to engage with specifics. The parallel is instructive because it demonstrates that the dismissal mechanism is not specific to Assyriology, to ancient studies, or to claims about the Anunnaki. It is a feature of how credentialed disciplines manage heterodox propositions. The proposition is assessed not on its internal logic, but on its proximity to previously categorized claims. If it sounds like something already in the fringe bin, it goes in the fringe bin. The specific data, the specific argument, the specific textual evidence, these are subordinated to the category, and once the category is assigned, engagement becomes professionally risky. A junior Assyriologist who published a peer-reviewed analysis of Sitchin's structural argument about the Atrahasis post-flood passage, even an analysis that ultimately rejected the argument, would risk being associated with the category. The safer professional move is silence, and silence is precisely what the field has produced. That silence is not neutral. It carries consequences, not just for the interpretation of the Atrahasis, but for how we understand the entire architecture of post-flood traditions in Mesopotamian thought. Because the Atrahasis is not the only text that draws a sharp structural line between the world before the flood and the world after it. The Sumerian king list, preserved most completely on the Weld-Blundell prism, a clay prism approximately 20 centimeters tall, inscribed on all four sides, held in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England, contains the most dramatic numerical expression of that line. The king list divides all of known history into two eras: before the flood, after the flood. The phrase in the Sumerian text is direct: the flood swept over. Everything before that phrase belongs to one world. Everything after it belongs to another. And the difference between those two worlds is quantified. Before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. The first dynasty of Eridu, the city that Mesopotamian tradition assigns as the seat of Enki himself, lists two kings ruling for a combined total of 64,800 years. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar for 36,000 years. At Bad Tibira, the second antediluvian city, three kings ruled for a combined 108,000 years. The total for all 8 antediluvian kings across 5 cities is 241,200 years. After the flood, the numbers collapse. The first post-diluvian dynasty of Kish lists kings whose reigns, while still large by modern standards, the longest being 1,200 years, represent a reduction of more than 2 orders of magnitude. This is not a gradual literary transition. It is a cliff, a discontinuity, a parametric break, and it maps directly onto the Atrahasis post-flood directive concerning lifespan limitation. If Enki's speech is mythological metaphor, a literary device to explain why humans do not live forever, then the king list's numerical discontinuity is a coincidence. Two independent textual traditions happen to encode the same structural break in different symbolic registers. If Enki's speech is institutional policy, a parameter update applied to the human species after the flood, then the king list is recording the downstream data. The numbers changed because the parameters changed. The parameters changed because Enki changed them, in a speech preserved on a clay tablet in the British Museum. The numerical system of the king list deserves closer attention because it is not arbitrary. Thorkild Jacobson, who published the definitive critical edition of the Sumerian king list in 1939 through the University of Chicago Press, observed that the antediluvian reign lengths are not random large numbers. They are multiples of specific base units, principally the Sar, a unit of 3,600, and the Ner, a unit of 600. Alulim's 28,800 years is exactly 8 Sar. Alalgar's 36,000 years is exactly 10 Sar. Enmenlu Anna of Bad Tibira ruled for 43,200 years, 12 Sar. The numbers are not poetic exaggerations. They are mathematical. They operate within a sexagesimal framework, base 60, that is the foundational counting system of Sumerian mathematics. The same system that gave us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. When the king list assigns antediluvian reign lengths in multiples of the Sar, it is using a mathematical vocabulary that was deeply embedded in Sumerian institutional practice. Tax records used it, astronomical calculations used it, land surveys used it, and the king list uses it to express reign lengths that mainstream scholarship characterizes as symbolic or legendary. But here is the detail that has not received the attention it warrants. If the numbers are symbolic, why are they expressed in an administrative counting system? If they are literary exaggerations meant to convey the grandeur of the primordial age, why do they conform to the same mathematical base used for grain inventories and canal dimensions? Literary exaggeration does not typically constrain itself to institutional number systems. The Genesis genealogies, which parallel the king list in structure, use round numbers that do not conform to a consistent mathematical base. The Vedic Yuga cycle uses numbers that follow a 4-3-2-1 ratio. The Sumerian king list uses Sa. And that specificity, the use of an administrative unit, not a literary trope, is the kind of detail that rewards attention. The Eridu Genesis, another Sumerian flood text, fragmentary but partially preserved on a tablet now held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, contains parallel material that deepens this reading. The Eridu Genesis describes the establishment of the first cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, the same 5 cities named in the antediluvian section of the king list. After the flood, the gods re-establish urban civilization. They assign new functions. They reorganize. And the cities they establish are not random settlements. They are specific sites with assigned purposes. Eridu is the seat of Enki. Bad Tibira is associated with metalworking. Larak is a cult center. Sippar is associated with the sun god Utu. Shuruppak, the city of Atrahasis himself, the city from which the flood hero is said to have departed, is the last of the 5. These 5 cities form a network, and the king list preserves their sequence not as a chronological narrative, but as a functional assignment. Which city held kingship, for how long, and in what order? The post-flood re-establishment of these cities is not described as rebuilding in the physical sense. It is described as the reassignment of the me, the redistribution of the parameters of civilized existence to specific institutional centers. This is governance. It is the allocation of functions to administrative units, and it is presented in the Eridu Genesis as a divine act, the gods deciding, after the catastrophe, which parameters go where, which cities serve which purposes, which institutions operate under which conditions. The Sumerian concept that governs this reorganization is the me, and this term requires careful definition, because it is the conceptual key that makes the post-flood passage legible as institutional action, rather than mythological narrative. The me have no clean English equivalent. They are sometimes translated as divine decrees, sometimes as cosmic principles, sometimes as cultural norms, but none of these translations captures the operational character of the concept. The me are the parameters of civilized existence. They include kingship, priesthood, truth, the descent into the underworld, sexual intercourse, the art of the scribe, the art of the carpenter, the kindling of fire, the extinguishing of fire, the making of music, the wearing of clean garments. The goddess Inanna's famous journey to Eridu, preserved in a Sumerian text known to scholars as Inanna and Enki, lists over 100 me that Enki holds in his possession and that Inanna obtains through a combination of wit and divine intoxicant. Each me is not an abstract idea, it is a functional parameter, a switch that can be turned on or off, a setting that can be transferred from one city to another. And Enki, in the Sumerian tradition, is their custodian. He holds them, he dispenses them, he withholds them, he grants them when he is pleased, and regrets the grant when he is sober. When the Atrahasis describes Enki issuing post-flood directives, establishing new categories of women, assigning the Pashittu demon, limiting lifespans, it is describing Enki doing precisely what the entire Sumerian mythological corpus says Enki does. He is adjusting the me, he is recalibrating the operational parameters of human civilization. The mainstream reading acknowledges this connection in general terms. Daly notes it. Jean Bottero, the French Assyriologist at the École pratique des hautes études, discusses Enki's custodianship of the me in his Mesopotamia, Writing, Reasoning, and the Gods, published in 1992. F.A.M. Wigeman, the Dutch Assyriologist at the University of Amsterdam, has written about the relationship between divine decrees and institutional reality in Mesopotamian thought. But none of these scholars pursues the implication to its structural conclusion. If the me are functional parameters, and Enki is their custodian, then Enki's post-flood speech is a parameter update, not a metaphor about parameters, not a literary allusion to the concept of divine governance. The parameters themselves recorded in narrative form because narrative was how Mesopotamian scribes documented institutional change. The temple hymns are administrative documents dressed as poetry. The creation myths are institutional charters dressed as theology. The post-flood speech is a governance update dressed as divine decree. The form is mythological, the content is operational, and the distinction between those two readings, form versus content, metaphor versus mechanism, is exactly the distinction that mainstream Assyriology has declined to examine. To understand why Enki, rather than Enlil, rather than Anu, rather than any other deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon, is the one who delivers the post-flood speech, it helps to understand who Enki is across the entire textual corpus, because his character is remarkably consistent over thousands of years of literary tradition. Enki is not the ruler. That is Enlil, or above Enlil, Anu, the sky god. Enki is the problem solver. He is the engineer. His domain is the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the Earth's surface, feeding the rivers, the marshes, the springs. His temple at Eridu, the southernmost of the great Sumerian cities, located near the head of the Persian Gulf in what is now southern Iraq, was called the Abzu, the House of the Deep Water. Archaeological excavations at Eridu, conducted initially by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd in the 1940s under the auspices of the Iraqi Directorate of Antiquities, revealed something remarkable. Beneath the visible ruins, the excavators found a sequence of temple foundations stacked one on top of another, 18 distinct building levels, each constructed on the foundations of its predecessor, extending back to approximately 4800 BCE. The earliest structure, level 18, was a simple single-room building, barely more than a sand hut, with a niche in the wall and a floor littered with fish bones. The offerings at the earliest level of Enki's temple were fish. By level 6, the temple had become a monumental structure on a raised platform, with buttressed walls and a complex interior plan. The continuity of function, from sand hut to monumental temple, over 3,000 years of continuous occupation, is virtually unique in the archaeological record of the ancient Near East. It means that whatever was being worshipped at Eridu was being worshipped there from the very beginning of urban civilization in southern Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamian tradition says what was worshipped there was Enki, the god of the Abzu, the custodian of the Me, the engineer who created humanity, saved it from the flood, and then imposed the terms under which the survivors would be permitted to continue. Enki's association with that site is not late, it is foundational. He is there from the beginning, and his character, clever, subversive, technically proficient, willing to break rules when the rules produce bad outcomes, is consistent across every text in which he appears. In the Atrahasis, he creates humanity when no other solution to the Igigi revolt presents itself. In the flood narrative, he warns Atrahasis when the assembly has voted for annihilation. In the myth of Inanna and the Me, he distributes the parameters of civilization while intoxicated and then tries to reclaim them, a narrative that reads simultaneously as comedy and as a parable about the uncontrollable distribution of technology. In the Enki and Ninhursag myth, he transgresses sexual boundaries in the paradise of Dilmun and is cursed, then healed. In every tradition, he is the figure who acts when the system stalls. He is the one who intervenes when the established order fails to account for reality. His role in the post-flood passage is perfectly consistent with this character. The assembly voted to destroy humanity. Enki preserved it. The assembly was furious. Enki negotiated new terms. He is not a benevolent savior in the modern sense. He is an institutional actor who operates at the boundary of authorized conduct and whose interventions consistently produce outcomes that the ruling authority did not intend but cannot undo. This characterization matters because it reframes the post-flood speech from a generic divine pronouncement to a politically specific negotiating position. Enki is not issuing commandments from a position of supreme authority. He is proposing compromise from a position of institutional vulnerability. He disobeyed the assembly, he saved the species the assembly condemned, and now he must demonstrate that his unauthorized intervention will not produce the same conditions that triggered the crisis in the first. The 4 directives are his guarantee. They are his argument to Enlil and the assembly that humanity can continue to exist without exceeding the system's capacity. Controlled fertility reduces the growth rate. Institutional celibacy removes a fraction of the reproductive population permanently. Infant mortality acts as a continuous correction. Lifespan limitation prevents any individual human from accumulating enough knowledge or power to become a systemic risk. Read this way. The directives are not cruelty, they are engineering. And Enki, the engineer god, the keeper of the me, the custodian of the Abzu, is exactly the figure the text would assign to deliver them. And this operational reading gains force, becomes harder to dismiss as mere interpretive preference when you look beyond Mesopotamia. Because the pattern of flood followed by institutional restructuring is not confined to cuneiform texts. It appears, with structural precision, in traditions separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, preserved in languages that share no common ancestor, and in cultures that had no documented contact with Mesopotamia. The Book of Enoch, specifically 1st Enoch, the Ethiopian apocalyptic text preserved in Ge'ez, canonical in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, and dated by scholars to various periods between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, contains a parallel that goes beyond thematic resemblance. In the Enochic tradition, a class of divine beings called the Watchers descend to Earth. They interbreed with human women. Their offspring, the Nephilim, beings of enormous size and appetite, destabilize the Earth through violence and uncontrolled consumption. God sends the flood as a corrective, but before the flood and after it, specific assignments are made. The angel Uriel warns Noah. The angel Raphael is tasked with binding Azazel, the leader of the transgressing Watchers. And the post-flood world is established under new terms, a world in which the boundary between divine and human is no longer permeable, in which the direct contact that produced the Nephilim is sealed off, in which access to divine knowledge becomes mediated through prophecy and priesthood rather than through physical cohabitation. The parallel is not merely thematic, divine anger, flood, survival, new order. The parallel is structural. Both the Atrahasis and 1st Enoch describe a pre-flood world in which the boundary between divine and human categories was porous, a catastrophe triggered by the consequences of that porosity, and a post-catastrophe institutional restructuring specifically designed to prevent recurrence. Both traditions specify mechanisms. Both traditions assign agents. Both traditions frame the post-flood world as deliberately constrained relative to the pre-flood world. The specificity of the Enochic tradition deserves emphasis, because it extends beyond general thematic parallels into precise institutional assignment. 1st Enoch does not simply say that God punished the Watchers and then moved on. It names the punishing agents and their specific tasks. Raphael is assigned to bind Azazel, a specific Watcher identified by name, and to cast him into a specific place, a pit in the desert of Dudael. Michael is assigned to bind Shemihaza, the leader of the 200 who descended on Mount Hermon. Gabriel is tasked with destroying the offspring of the Watchers, the Nephilim, by inciting them to kill one another. These are not vague divine judgments. They are operational assignments, named agents, named targets, specified actions. The post-flood restructuring in 1st Enoch reads, like the Atrahasis, as a set of institutional directives embedded in a narrative of divine crisis management. The question of how a Jewish apocalyptic text from the Hellenistic period came to share this structural feature with an Akkadian text from the Old Babylonian period, whether through direct literary dependence, through shared Mesopotamian cultural heritage, or through independent derivation from a common institutional memory, is one of the most important unresolved questions in the comparative study of ancient Near Eastern literature. The Genesis account, chapters 6 through 9, compresses much of this into a shorter narrative, but preserves the essential structure. The Nephilim appear. The violence increases. God sends the flood. Noah survives. And after the waters recede, God establishes a covenant, new terms for human existence. The rainbow is the sign, the dietary laws are the mechanism. The prohibition against shedding human blood is the constraint. It is less granular than the Atrahasis. It does not specify 4 interlocking population control mechanisms, but it is structurally identical, a boundary violation, a catastrophe, a survival. and then new rules imposed by the surviving authority, applicable to the generation that comes after. The Greek tradition, though it developed in a different cultural matrix entirely, carries its own version of the pattern. The Prometheus myth, as preserved in Hesiod's Works and Days and Theogony, composed in approximately the 8th century BCE, describes a divine figure who acts against the will of the ruling god to benefit humanity. Prometheus steals fire from Zeus and gives it to humans. Zeus punishes both Prometheus and humanity. The punishment is not annihilation, it is constraint. Pandora is created, and with her comes the introduction of disease, old age, toil, and suffering into the human condition. The structural parallel to Enki is striking. Both Enki and Prometheus are divine figures who act outside their authority. Both give something to humans that the ruling power did not intend them to have. Both trigger a catastrophic divine response. And in both traditions, the aftermath is not the destruction of humanity, but its restructuring under diminished terms. The post-Prometheus world, like the post-flood world of the Atrahasis, is a world of imposed limitation. The difference is that in the Greek version, the limitations are framed as punishment, while in the Atrahasis, they are framed as policy. The emotional register differs. The structural outcome is the same. The Popol Vuh pushes this parallel further still. The Quiche Maya creation text, composed in the Quiche language using Latin script in the mid-16th century, preserving an oral tradition of unknown antiquity, with the surviving manuscript now held in the Newberry Library in Chicago, describes not one but multiple creation attempts. The gods form humans from mud. They fail. The mud dissolves. The creatures cannot hold their shape. The gods form humans from wood. The wood people are functional. They walk. They speak. They reproduce. But they lack something essential. They do not remember their makers. They do not offer praise. They do not raise their eyes. The gods destroy them in a catastrophic flood. The description of that destruction in the Popol Vuh is visceral and specific. The wooden people's own cooking pots and grinding stones rise up against them. Their dogs turn on them. Their houses collapse. The very objects they created to serve them, the tools of daily life, become the instruments of their annihilation. This is not a generalized apocalypse. It is a systems failure in which the created order reverses itself. The tools rebel against their users, just as the Igigi rebelled against the gods in the Atrahasis, just as the products of the system exceed the system's tolerance. The parallel extends even to the specific failure mode. In the Atrahasis, the problem is noise, the output of a productive species exceeding the capacity of the governing system. In the Popol Vuh, the problem is forgetting, a productive species failing to acknowledge the system that created it. Both are failures of the interface between creator and creation. Both trigger systematic destruction. Both are followed by a new creation under tighter specifications. Then the gods try again. They form humans from maize dough, ground white and yellow corn. These humans are perfect, too perfect. They can see everything, know everything, perceive as clearly and as far as the gods themselves. And so the gods deliberately limit them. They fog their vision. They reduce their perception. They close the aperture. This is not a narrative about why humans cannot see the future. It is a narrative about a maker who calibrates a creation downward, who imposes constraints on a being that, unconstrained, would be indistinguishable from its creator. The vocabulary is Mesoamerican. The cosmological framework is Quiche. But the structural logic, creation, excess, destruction, recreation with imposed limitations, is identical to the Atrahasis. And the critical detail is this. In both texts, the limitations are not punishments. They are design features. They are imposed not in anger but in engineering. The gods of the Popol Vuh do not hate their maize dough humans. They are adjusting specifications. Enki does not curse the post-flood generation. He is updating parameters. The emotional register is not wrath, it is calibration. The Vedic tradition encodes its own version. The Matsya Purana, the Sanskrit text that preserves one of the oldest Hindu flood narratives, describes Manu, the first man, warned by a fish that is revealed to be an avatar of Vishnu, that a great deluge will consume all life. Manu survives aboard a vessel. He performs sacrifices, and from those sacrifices, a new humanity emerges, but under terms that differ fundamentally from those that governed the previous age. The Mahayuga cycle, the vast temporal framework of Vedic cosmology, spanning 4,320,000 years per complete cycle, describes a progressive, structured decline from the Satya Yuga, the age of truth and perfection, through the Treta Yuga and the Dwapara Yuga, into the Kali Yuga, the current age of discord and diminishment. Each age is shorter than the one before. Each age is more constrained. Human lifespans decrease systematically, from 100,000 years in the Satya Yuga to a mere 100 in the Kali Yuga. The decline is not random. It is structured. It follows a ratio, 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. It is, in mathematical terms, a scheduled parameter reduction. The Satya Yuga lasts 1,728,000 years. The Treta Yuga lasts 1,296,000 years. The Dwapara lasts 864,000. The Kali Yuga, the present age, lasts 432,000. Each is exactly 3/4 of the one before. The mathematical precision of this decline is striking because it mirrors, in a different numerical register, the same phenomenon observed in the Sumerian king list, the use of a consistent mathematical system to express what is conventionally read as mythological time. The Vedic tradition uses a decimal system. The Sumerian tradition uses a sexagesimal system, but both traditions encode their parametric changes in administratively structured numbers, not in poetic approximations, and both traditions locate the sharpest discontinuity at the same structural point, the boundary between the pre-catastrophe world and the post-catastrophe world. The Vedic Manu survives the flood and inaugurates a diminished age. The Sumerian Ziusudra survives the flood, and kingship descends again, but at a fraction of its former duration. The structural correspondence is not thematic, it is mathematical. And the Yoruba Ifa divination corpus, the vast oral tradition of the Yoruba people of West Africa, transmitted across centuries by the Babalawo priestly class, recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, carries a structurally resonant account. The Orisha Obatala is tasked with fashioning human bodies from clay, but it is Olodumare, the supreme deity, who breathes life into them. When early humans overstep their bounds, when the boundary between the human world and the divine world is violated, the terms of existence change. Access to the divine becomes mediated. Ritual replaces direct encounter. The priesthood exists, in this tradition, because direct contact was revoked. The Hopi tradition of the American Southwest completes the pattern with a narrative that is almost schematic in its structural clarity. The Hopi describe 4 worlds: Tokpela, Tokpa, Kuskurza, and Tuakachi, the present 4th world. The first world was destroyed by fire when its inhabitants turned away from the creator Tiowa and began using their vibratory centers, their innate spiritual capacities, for selfish purposes. The second world was destroyed by ice when the same pattern repeated. The third world was destroyed by water, the Great Flood, when corruption once again reached a critical threshold. In each case, a faithful remnant, those who had maintained their covenant with the Creator, was guided to safety and emerged into the next world through a sipapu, an opening in the earth. The pattern is not merely repetitive, it is progressive. Each destruction is more severe. Each subsequent world is more constrained. The vibratory centers that humans possessed in the first world are progressively sealed off. The direct communication with the Creator that characterized the earliest age gives way to mediated access through ceremony, through priesthood, through specific ritual practice. The Hopi do not use the language of institutional parameters, but the structure they describe, progressive constraint, mediated access, reduced capability with each cycle, maps precisely onto the Atrahasis framework of post-catastrophe limitation. The Dogon people of Mali, in West Africa, preserve a cosmological tradition that French anthropologists Marcel Griaule and Germaine Dieterlen documented in the 1930s and 40s. The Dogon describe a creator being, Amma, who made the world and established the conditions of human existence. But those conditions were not the original design. The original creation was disrupted by a transgression, the premature action of the cosmic being Ogo, who violated the planned order of creation. As a result, the world was remade under altered terms. The twinning principle that was supposed to govern all life was broken. Death entered the system. Sacrifice became necessary. The Dogon do not describe a flood in the Mesopotamian sense, but they describe exactly the same structural event, an original design, a transgression, a remaking under reduced parameters. And the parameters, communicated to the Dogon through the Nommo, the ancestral beings who arrived from the star Sirius according to Dogon tradition, are specific. They include the structure of the granary, the arrangement of agricultural terraces, the organization of the priestly calendar. They are institutional parameters, not abstract moral guidelines. The details differ across all of these traditions. The names differ, the geographies differ, the languages share no common root, but the architecture repeats: a world, a transgression against designed limits, a destruction, a survival, and then, always, in every tradition, new terms. The generation after the last one does not inherit the old world, it inherits a reduced one. The strongest objection to the institutional reading of the Atrahasis post-flood passage comes not from Sitchin's critics per se, but from within the methodology of comparative mythology itself. The objection is this: the pattern of flood followed by new constraints is so widespread precisely because it is a universal narrative template, what scholars of comparative religion call a reset myth or a catastrophe and renewal archetype. Every civilization that experiences catastrophic flooding, and most riverine and coastal civilizations do, develops a narrative in which the old world was destroyed and the new world operates under diminished or different terms. The new terms are always more constrained because the narrative exists to explain present suffering by reference to a lost golden age. The direction of causation, in this reading, runs from human psychology to mythological expression, not from historical event to textual record. Botero made a version of this argument in his 1992 work. The Atrahasis is theological literature. It does serious intellectual work. It explains the human condition in terms that were meaningful to its ancient audience. It is sophisticated, but it is not reportage. Heiser's critique, operating on a different analytical plane, arrives at a compatible conclusion. Even if the Atrahasis post-flood passage is structurally coherent as an institutional package, even if the four directives do interlock in the way Sitchin described, that coherence could reflect the literary skill of the ancient author rather than the historical reality of an institutional directive. Good scribes structure their compositions well. A well-structured etiological passage is evidence of skilled literary craftsmanship, not evidence of a real post-catastrophe governance program. This objection deserves its full weight. It is methodologically serious. It accounts for the cross-cultural parallels through shared human psychology rather than shared historical memory or common descent from a single tradition. It explains the structural coherence through literary artistry rather than institutional documentation. And it does not require any extraordinary claims about who the Anunnaki were or what they did. But it does not account for everything. It does not explain why the Atrahasis post-flood directives are more specific than any structurally comparable passage in any other flood tradition worldwide. The Popol Vuh says the gods limited human perception. It does not specify four distinct interlocking mechanisms. Genesis 9 says God established a covenant with Noah, the so-called Noahide laws, but those laws concern diet, murder, and the rainbow as a sign. They do not prescribe institutional celibacy as a population management tool. The Matsya Purana says the ages decline. It does not name a specific demonic entity assigned to a specific regulatory function within the system. The Atrahasis is not merely structured, it is granular. It is administratively granular. And administrative granularity is a signature of record-keeping texts, of governance documents, of institutional policy, not of theological poetry or mythological narrative. There is a further complication that neither side of the debate has fully reckoned with, and it involves the relationship between the Atrahasis and the later Epic of Gilgamesh. Tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh Epic, the Flood Tablet, recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, the tablet that George Smith famously translated at the British Museum in 1872, reportedly becoming so excited that he began to undress, contains a retelling of the Atrahasis flood narrative. But the Gilgamesh version edits the post-flood material substantially. The 4 directives are absent. The institutional restructuring is compressed into a brief scene in which Enlil blesses Utnapishtim and his wife, granting them immortality, the opposite of the Atrahasis lifespan limitation, and sends them to live at the ends of the earth. The question this raises is significant. Why would a later redaction of the same tradition remove the most administratively specific material? If the post-flood directives are etiological myth, stories explaining why things are the way they are, then they should be the most durable part of the narrative, because they are the part the audience cares about most. Etiology is the payload. Remove the etiology and the myth loses its function. But if the directives are institutional policy embedded in narrative, then a later literary adaptation might reasonably omit them, the way a novelist adapting a government report would keep the dramatic narrative of the crisis but drop the appendix of regulatory changes. The Gilgamesh redaction behaves as if the Atrahasis post-flood material is an appendix, important to the original institutional context, irrelevant to the literary adaptation. The literary goals of the Gilgamesh poet were different from the institutional goals of the Atrahasis scribe. The Gilgamesh poet needed the flood as a narrative device, a mechanism to explain how Utnapishtim achieved immortality, which is the object of Gilgamesh's quest. The poet needed the storm, the boat, the survival, the divine reaction. What the poet did not need was the post-flood population management protocol. It served no narrative purpose within the Gilgamesh frame, and so it was cut. But here is the question the conventional reading does not address. If the post-flood directives are etiological myth, the explanatory payload of the flood narrative, the reason the story exists in the first place, why would any competent redactor remove them? You do not cut the explanation from an explanatory text. You do not remove the etiology from an etiological myth, unless the directives are not etiology. Unless they are something else, something the Gilgamesh redactor recognized as belonging to a different genre, serving a different purpose, addressed to a different audience, something institutional. This is not dispositive evidence for either reading, but it is a data point that the debate has not absorbed. George Smith, the self-taught Assyriologist who first recognized the flood narrative on Tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic in 1872, a man who had been a banknote engraver before teaching himself cuneiform in the British Museum's study room, understood immediately that the tablet contained material of enormous significance. The parallels to Genesis were obvious. The scholarly world was electrified, but the attention focused almost entirely on the flood narrative itself. The storm, the boat, the dove, the raven, the landing on the mountain. The post-flood material was treated as denouement, interesting but secondary. And in the Gilgamesh version, it largely is secondary, because the redactor had already stripped the institutional content. The Atrahasis original, with its 4 directives intact, sat in the same museum, in fragments that would not be fully assembled for another century. The institutional heart of the post-flood tradition, Enki's speech to the survivors, was present in the building where Smith worked. It was simply in a different box of fragments, waiting for Lambert and Millard to put it together. The debate, institutional document or literary masterpiece, remains genuinely unresolved. No peer-reviewed synthesis has been published that accounts satisfactorily for both the mythological parallels and the administrative granularity in a single internally coherent explanatory framework. If the Atrahasis post-flood passage is what the alternative reading argues it is, a governance directive from a non-human administrative authority to a surviving human population operating under new constraints, then certain specific revisions to conventional ancient chronology become necessary. The flood ceases to be a shared mythological motif inherited and embellished across cultures over millennia. It becomes a recorded event after which verifiable institutional changes were implemented. The entu priestess class, documented in administrative records from Ur and Sippar from the early 2nd millennium BCE onward, would not be a gradually evolved cultural institution that some creative scribe retroactively attributed to divine will. It would be a mandated institution, with a specific point of origin, created by specific decree, for a specific systemic purpose. The numerical discontinuity in the Sumerian king list, the cliff between antediluvian reigns of tens of thousands of years and post-diluvian reigns of hundreds, would not be a literary convention or a symbolic inflation of ancestral prestige. It would be a data record reflecting a real parametric change in the human condition. And the Atrahasis itself, the clay tablet in the British Museum, broken, reassembled, inscribed in a language that fell silent over 2,000 years ago, would not be literature in the way we conventionally understand that word. It would be a briefing document, a record of terms, a covenant imposed on a species that had been slated for termination and was granted continuance under conditions. The implications ripple outward into adjacent fields. Biblical archaeology would need to reassess the relationship between the Genesis flood narrative and its Mesopotamian antecedent, not as literary borrowing, which is already accepted, but as institutional inheritance. The covenant theology of Genesis 9, God's establishment of new terms with Noah after the flood, would no longer be an independent Israelite theological innovation. It would be a theological adaptation of a pre-existing institutional document. The Noahide laws would be a Hebrew editorial compression of the more granular Akkadian original. The entire Christian and Jewish theological tradition of covenant, the idea that God establishes binding contractual terms with humanity at specific historical junctures, would have a Mesopotamian administrative precedent that is older, more specific, and more institutionally granular than the biblical version. Comparative mythology would need to grapple with the possibility that the global pattern of flood followed by new constraints is not merely a shared archetype generated independently by universal human psychology, but a transmitted tradition, a memory, however distorted, of an actual institutional event whose specifics were preserved most precisely in the oldest known version and progressively simplified as the tradition passed through cultures that lacked the Mesopotamian bureaucratic vocabulary to maintain the granular detail. The study of ancient religion itself would need to reckon with a category it has not yet developed, the category of institutional theology, in which narrative functions not as metaphor for institutional reality, but as the delivery mechanism for institutional reality. The modern separation of myth from policy, of theology from governance, of sacred narrative from administrative procedure, this separation may itself be a modern projection. The Mesopotamians did not separate temple from state. They did not separate divine decree from administrative directive. Their temples were economic engines. Their priests were bureaucrats. Their hymns were institutional charters. If the post-flood passage of the Atrahasis is institutional content, and the structural evidence, at minimum, makes this a question worth asking, then the modern impulse to read it as merely mythological may be the most historically parochial interpretation available. It may be the reading that says the most about us and the least about the text. These are not small revisions, they are fundamental reframings. And the question that has not been answered seriously, not by Assyriology, not by comparative mythology, not by biblical archaeology, is not whether this reading is correct. It is why the specific passages that could resolve the question one way or the other, the closing columns of Tablet 3, the post-flood directives, the speech Enki delivered to the generation after the last one, receive less sustained scholarly attention than virtually any other section of the text. The Atrahasis tablets are in the British Museum. They have been there since the 19th century. Lambert and Millard's critical edition has been in print since 1969. Daly's accessible translation has been available since 1989. The post-flood passage, the closing columns of Tablet 3, is available to any scholar, any graduate student, any interested reader with access to an academic library. What Enki said to the generation that survived, the generation that was not supposed to exist, the generation that inherited a world redesigned around their limitation, is still inscribed on those clay fragments. The 4 directives are specific, the mechanisms interlock, the administrative granularity is present in the Akkadian and present in every competent translation. The silence around these passages is not the silence of resolution, it is the silence of a question that the credentialed disciplines have not yet taken seriously enough to answer. The tablet is in the British Museum. The text has been published, and the terms Enki imposed on the generation after the last one, the conditions under which that generation was permitted to continue, remain open. They have been open since Lambert and Millard first set the cuneiform into English in 1969. They are still open now.